She was 19 and homeless. She had no home, no savings, no family to call, no second chances left to spend. What she got instead was a crumbling stone chapel on the edge of a town that had forgotten its own name, sitting behind a wall of ivy so thick it looked like the building was trying to hide from the world. People laughed when they heard about her inheritance. To them, it was worthless, a pile of stone with a caved-in roof and pews that had rotted where they stood. But what none of them knew was that the chapel was hiding something that would change her life forever. Sealed behind its altar for over 60 years, waiting for someone who finally had nothing left to lose. Before we continue, if stories like this inspire you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Her name was Reese Calloway, and 3 weeks before her 19th birthday, she had exactly $141 to her name, a duffel bag of clothes, and a phone with a cracked screen that her stepfather had thrown at her during the argument that ended everything. The argument itself didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the locksmith changing the deadbolt on the only house she'd lived in since she was 7, and her stepfather standing on the porch with his arms crossed, telling her that she was an adult now and adults figured things out on their own. Her mother had died 4 years earlier, breast cancer. Fast and merciless. And in the time since then, Reese had become something like a guest in her own childhood home, tolerated but never quite welcomed. And now, not even that. She spent the first 2 nights in her car, an old Honda with a check engine light that never turned off, parked in the lot of a 24-hour laundromat because it was the only place that felt safe enough to close her eyes. Before all of that, before the laundromat parking lot and the duffel bag and the locksmith on the porch, there had been a house that Reese once believed was permanent. Her mother, Diane, had married her stepfather, Gary, when Reese was 6, and for a few years it had felt like enough, like a version of a family that might actually hold. Diane worked long shifts as a home health aide, tending to elderly patients across 3 counties, coming home smelling of hand sanitizer and instant coffee, always too tired to do more than kiss Reese's forehead before falling asleep in front of the television. Gary worked at a tire distribution warehouse and kept mostly to himself, not unkind exactly, but never warm either. The kind of man who filled a room with silence rather than conversation. Reese had learned early not to expect much from him and had built her entire sense of home instead around her mother. Around the particular way Diane hummed off key while folding laundry. Around Sunday mornings spent making pancakes together before Gary woke up. The diagnosis came when Reese was 15. Stage 3, then Stage 4 within 8 months, the kind of fast, merciless progression that left almost no room to prepare. Reese remembered sitting in hospital hallways, doing homework on her knees because there was nowhere else to sit. Remembered the particular sound of her mother's labored breathing in the final weeks. Remembered Gary standing at the edges of every room during that time. Present, but somehow already gone. Diane died 2 days after Reese's 16th birthday. The birthday cake, half eaten, sat forgotten in the refrigerator for a week afterward because no one in that house could bring themselves to throw it away or finish it. The 3 years that followed were not cruel exactly. Not in any dramatic sense Reese could point to and call abuse, but they were cold in a way that wore her down slowly rather than all at once. Gary paid for groceries and kept the electricity on and otherwise treated Reese like a tenant he'd inherited rather than a daughter he'd chosen, which in fairness she supposed she was. He remarried quickly, 18 months after Diane's funeral, to a woman named Sherry, who made it clear without ever quite saying so that Reese's presence in the house was tolerated rather than wanted. Reese kept her grades up through it, worked a part-time job at a pharmacy through her last 2 years of high school, and told herself that things would be different once she turned 18 and had options. But options, it turned out, required money she didn't have, and by 19 she was still living in that house, still saving what little she could, still waiting for a version of independence that never quite arrived on schedule. The argument that ended everything had been about something almost embarrassingly small, a shouting match over unwashed dishes that had clearly been building for years underneath the surface of every smaller disagreement before it. Sherry had said something cutting about Reese needing to grow up and move on already. Reese had said something back she couldn't fully remember afterward, only that Gary's face had gone very still and very final, the way a door looks right before it closes. 2 days later there was a locksmith on the porch, and a duffel bag on the lawn, and a phone with a cracked screen where it had struck the pavement, and 19 years of a life that had never quite belonged to her in the first place, over. It was on the third night after that, scrolling through old emails on her cracked phone, looking for anything, any thread of stability, that she found a message from a law office in Vermont she had never heard of. Whitmore and Associates. The subject line read simply, regarding the estate of Eleanor Hastings. Reese almost deleted it, certain it was spam, until she saw her mother's maiden name buried in the second paragraph. Hastings, her mother's family name, a name Reese had heard maybe 3 times in her entire life. Always spoken quickly and never explained, the way people talk about relatives they'd rather forget. The lawyer on the phone, a soft-spoken man named Arthur Whitmore, who sounded close to retirement, explained that Eleanor Hastings, Reese's great-aunt on her maternal grandmother's side, had passed away 2 months prior at the age of 94, and that in the absence of any closer living relatives who had bothered to stay in contact, the entirety of her small estate had passed to Reese. Reese had asked, voice flat with exhaustion, what exactly the estate consisted of. Arthur Whitmore had paused in a way that told her he already knew how this would sound. A property, he said, a former chapel, deconsecrated, on 11 acres outside a town called Millbrook Hollow. No other assets of significance. Some furniture. Some papers. He told her the back taxes were paid up through the county's historical preservation exemption, so at least there would be nothing owed. When Reese asked if the chapel was worth anything, Arthur Whitmore had been honest with her in a way she would later be grateful for. Structurally, he said, it's in poor condition. Financially, it's probably worth less than the land under it. But it's yours, free and clear, if you want it. She had nothing else. So she said yes. The drive to Millbrook Hollow took 6 hours, and the check engine light stayed on the entire way, glowing amber against the dashboard like a small persistent warning she'd decided to ignore because she had no other choice. Somewhere around the 4-hour mark, the highway narrowed into a state route, and the state route narrowed into a county road, and the county road eventually became a gravel lane so overgrown that branches scraped along both sides of her car like the forest was trying to reclaim the path before she could reach the end of it. She passed a hand-painted sign, weathered to near illegibility, that read Millbrook Hollow, Pop, 340. And beneath it, added later in different paint, a much smaller number that had been crossed out twice. The town itself was barely a town at all. A gas station with 2 pumps, one of them out of order. A diner with a hand-lettered closed sign that looked like it hadn't been flipped to open in months. A church, an actual functioning one, white clapboard with a steeple that leaned very slightly to the left, as if it too had grown tired standing against the wind. Reese stopped at the gas station to ask directions, and the man behind the counter, gray-bearded, maybe 70, wearing a flannel shirt despite the late summer heat, had looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You're the girl inheriting the old Hastings Chapel," he said. It wasn't a question. News apparently traveled fast in a town this small, or perhaps Arthur Whitmore's office had made calls ahead. Reese said that she was, and the old man's expression didn't shift into pity or curiosity, but into something more careful, more measured, like he was deciding how much to say to a stranger. "Some things aren't lost," he told her, ringing up her bottle of water without being asked to. "They're buried on purpose." He didn't elaborate. When she asked him what he meant, he only shrugged and told her the chapel was 2 miles past the fork, that she couldn't miss it, and that she should mind the floor near the altar because old Eleanor never did get around to fixing the boards there. Reese thanked him and left, telling herself that small towns just talked like this. Riddles and warnings passed around like currency, because there was little else to spend words on. Still, she found herself glancing in the rearview mirror as she pulled out of the gas station lot, half expecting to see Walt still watching her go, and he was, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, in the way of someone who knows more about a place than he's willing to hand over to a stranger all at once. The 2 miles past the fork took her along a lane bordered by dense oak forest on both sides, the afternoon light dimming to a green-gold filter as the branches closed in overhead, and Reese noticed, without quite being able to explain why it unsettled her, that she didn't pass a single other house or driveway along the entire stretch. As though the chapel had been deliberately set apart from everything else in the valley, tucked away at the end of a road that led nowhere else at all. The chapel appeared at the end of the gravel lane exactly as Arthur Whitmore had described it, and exactly as she had not expected it. It stood alone in a clearing surrounded by old oak trees, gray stone walls streaked green with decades of moss, a bell tower with no bell, and a roofline that sagged in the middle like the whole structure was slowly exhaling. Ivy had climbed the western wall so completely that the stained glass window there was barely visible beneath the leaves, just fragments of blue and red glass peeking through like eyes half open. The air around it was cooler than it had any right to be in late July, and utterly silent. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of wind moving through the oak branches overhead. Reese sat in her car for almost 10 minutes before she found the will to get out. The front doors were oak, swollen with humidity, and it took her shoulder and most of her remaining strength to force them open. Inside, dust hung suspended in shafts of colored light falling through the one intact window, and the air smelled of cold stone, old wood, and something faintly sweet underneath it all, like dried flowers left too long in a closed room. The pews, 12 rows of them, sat crooked and split. Some collapsed entirely where water damage had rotted through the legs. At the front of the chapel stood the altar, a simple stone table, and behind it a wall where a cross had clearly once hung, the outline of it still visible in a lighter patch of stone, though the cross itself was long gone. She walked the center aisle slowly, her footsteps swallowed by the thick silence, running her fingers along the backs of the pews, feeling the grain of wood that had sat here through decades of Sunday mornings before whatever had happened here had happened, before the town's faith had apparently moved 2 miles down the road to the white clapboard church with the leaning steeple. The cold in the chapel was different from the cold outside, heavier somehow, settling into the stone floor and rising up through the soles of her shoes. She could feel it in her fingertips as she trailed them along the pewbacks, in the tip of her nose, in the small hairs along her arms that refused to lie flat no matter how she rubbed them. Dust moved in slow, lazy spirals through the shaft of colored light from the one surviving window, disturbed by her footsteps, and then settling again once she stood still, as though the room itself was holding its breath along with her. Somewhere above, in the exposed rafters where the ceiling had partially given way, she heard the faint scratch and flutter of something small, a bird or bat that had made a home in the gap, and the sound seemed impossibly loud against the otherwise total silence. The smell was the part that stayed with her longest afterward, Cold stone and old wood, and underneath it all that faint sweetness, like flowers pressed inside a book and forgotten there for decades. A smell with no obvious source that she could never quite locate, no matter how many times she circled the room searching for it. She would learn later, from the same gray-bearded gas station owner, that the chapel had been deconsecrated back in the 60s after some falling out between the congregation and a bishop nobody could quite remember the details of anymore, and that Eleanor Hastings had bought the property for almost nothing shortly after, moving into a small caretaker's cottage behind it and living there alone for the better part of 60 years, rarely seen in town, never unfriendly but never warm. The kind of woman people described as keeping to herself, in a tone that suggested there was more to say and no one willing to say it. That first night, Reese slept in her car in the gravel lot beside the chapel rather than risk the cottage, whose door hung open on one hinge and whose windows were too dark and too still to walk toward after sunset. She told herself it was only for one night, that in the morning things would look more manageable, and mostly she was right, though the finding of what lay beneath the altar was still 8 days away, and those 8 days would be some of the strangest and most quietly frightening of her life. The following morning she explored the cottage in full daylight and found it more livable than she'd expected. Someone, Eleanor presumably, had kept it simple but clean well into her final years. A wood stove for heat, a single bed with a quilt gone thin with age, a writing desk covered in yellowed papers Reese didn't yet have the courage to read, a small bookshelf holding mostly Bibles and gardening almanacs. It was, in its own worn way, the first place in a long time that felt like it belonged to her rather than being borrowed or tolerated. Over the following days, Reese did what she could to make the cottage functional. She swept, she aired out the mattress in the sun, she cleared the brush choking the small garden plot behind the house, and she asked around town carefully for any odd jobs that might bring in enough money for groceries and gas. The gray-bearded gas station man, whose name she learned was Walt Pemberton, gave her cash for helping him restock shelves twice a week. An elderly woman named Dot Ferris, who ran what remained of the diner, occasionally paid her to wash dishes on the weekends when a busload of hikers passing through the nearby state forest made the tiny place briefly, chaotically busy. It wasn't much. It was enough to survive, which after the last several months felt like an almost obscene luxury. But every evening, after the work was done and the light had gone gold and then gray over the oak trees, Reese found herself walking back into the chapel, drawn to it in a way she couldn't fully explain, running her hands along the same stone altar, staring at the same water-stained boards Walt Pemberton had warned her about, the ones just in front of where the cross used to hang. Something about the way those boards sat, slightly raised at one corner, slightly darker than the wood around them, nagged at her more each time she looked. On the 8th night, she brought a flashlight and a crowbar she'd found rusting in the cottage shed, and she knelt down in front of the altar, and she began to pry. The first board came up easier than she expected, releasing a breath of cold, stale air from underneath, air that smelled of earth and something metallic. Nothing, she thought at first, staring into the dark gap beneath the floor. Just packed dirt. Just shadow. She pulled harder at the second board. It resisted, groaned, gave, still nothing. Just more darkness. More of that cold breath rising up to meet her face. She kept working, board by board, her arms aching, her knees bruising against the stone floor, sweat gathering at her hairline despite the chill in the air. Splinters bit into her palms. She didn't stop. The third board wouldn't move at all. She wedged the crowbar deeper. Pushed down with her full weight. Nothing, she repositioned. Tried again. A crack, sharp and sudden, echoing off the stone walls like a gunshot, and she froze, heart slamming, certain for one absurd second that she'd broken something irreparable, some structural piece holding the whole floor together. She hadn't. It was only the board itself, finally splitting along an old grain line, and beneath it, more darkness, more of that same cold breath, except this time catching the edge of her flashlight beam, something that wasn't dirt. Something that reflected light back at her. Dull and metallic, half buried beneath a century of settled dust. Her hands were shaking now, not from cold. She didn't let herself think too hard about why. She kept prying. The fourth board cracked and gave way all at once, and beneath it, in a shallow recess carved directly into the stone foundation, sat a metal chest, roughly 2 feet across, its surface dark with age but its lock, remarkably, still intact and unbroken. Reese sat back on her heels, flashlight trembling slightly in her grip, staring at it. There was a name etched crudely into the lid, worn nearly smooth by time, but still legible if she tilted the light just right. Hastings. It took her almost 20 more minutes to work the old lock loose, using a combination of the crowbar and eventually a long thin nail she found nearby, jimmying it with a patience she didn't know she had until that exact moment. When the lock finally gave, with a small metallic groan that seemed far too loud in the chapel's silence, she lifted the lid slowly, half expecting it to be empty, half expecting something worse. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow, were not the coins or jewelry she might have half hoped for in some secret corner of her mind, but papers. Dozens of them. Letters. Tied together with disintegrating ribbon. Property deeds. A hand-drawn map of the surrounding land, marked with small symbols she didn't yet understand. And at the very bottom, a single sealed envelope, thicker than the rest, with one word written across the front in careful, aged handwriting. Reese. Her own name, written by a woman she had never met, sealed away decades before Reese herself had even been born. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter from Eleanor Hastings herself, dated 11 years earlier, long before Reese's mother had even gotten sick, long before any of this could have possibly been anticipated by anyone still living. The letter explained, in Eleanor's careful, old-fashioned script, that the Hastings family had once owned nearly the entire valley surrounding Millbrook Hollow, going back 4 generations, before a series of bad decisions, a bad marriage, and a falling out over the chapel's deconsecration had fractured the family and scattered its members across the country, severing contact, burying old grudges instead of resolving them. Eleanor wrote that she had spent the last decades of her life alone specifically because she'd refused to sell the land to developers who wanted to turn the valley into vacation properties, and that she had hidden the original deeds, along with documentation of a small trust fund established generations earlier and largely forgotten by the family's more distant, disinterested branches, because she wanted it to go to whoever in the family finally needed it enough to come looking. She wrote that she didn't know which of her scattered relatives, if any, would ever find this chest, but she hoped it would be someone who had nowhere else left to turn, because that person would understand, better than anyone with an easier life ever could, what this valley and this land were actually worth. The documents beneath the letter detailed a trust established by Eleanor's own grandfather nearly 70 years earlier and quietly maintained ever since through a conservative investment account that Arthur Whitmore's firm, it turned out, had also been managing without full knowledge of its ultimate purpose, worth, after decades of slow compounding growth, just over $2 million. The map beneath the letter showed the valley as it had once been, before roads had been renamed and property lines redrawn, small symbols marking a mill that no longer stood, an orchard long since reclaimed by forest, a family cemetery Reese hadn't even known existed, tucked into a hillside a half-mile from the chapel itself. She would visit that cemetery 2 days later and find headstones going back 5 generations, Hastings' names worn nearly smooth by weather, and would stand there for a long time reading dates and trying to imagine the lives attached to them. Women who had loved this valley enough to be buried in it, and men who had apparently loved it enough to fight and fracture a family trying to protect it. The letters tied with disintegrating ribbon, she would learn over the following days of careful reading, told a longer and sadder story than the single note addressed to her. They were correspondence between Eleanor and various far-flung relatives over decades, each one a small, polite, increasingly distant attempt to reconnect that had apparently gone nowhere. Cousins who'd moved to Ohio and California and never written back, a brother who'd died estranged in the 80s without ever visiting the valley again. Eleanor's own handwriting grew smaller and more careful in the later letters, as though she'd resigned herself, decade by decade, to being the last one who remembered why any of it had mattered in the first place. Reese sat on the cold stone floor of the chapel for a long time after reading it, the flashlight beam wavering against the ceiling, the letter trembling in her fingers, and she cried. Not from joy exactly, not yet, but from the sheer disorienting weight of realizing that a woman she had never met, a woman who had died alone in a small cottage having spent 60 years waiting, had left her a second chance 60 years before Reese would ever need one. She thought of her mother, of the humming and the pancakes and the 4 years of illness that had taken all of it away, and she thought that perhaps this was the closest thing she would ever get to her mother reaching back across the years to catch her before she fell any further. Even if the hand doing the catching belonged to a great aunt she had never once met. Before we continue further into her story, we want to remind you that stories like Reese's remind us why we do this. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. The weeks that followed the discovery moved slower than Reese expected, because money, it turned out, did not fix everything overnight, and she found she didn't entirely want it to. Arthur Whitmore verified the trust's authenticity within days, visibly stunned that a fund his firm had been quietly managing for decades on autopilot turned out to have this much history and this much value behind it. He guided her carefully through the legal process of claiming it, explained tax implications she barely understood, and connected her with a financial advisor named Priya Anand, who would become, over the following months, something between a mentor and a friend. But rather than leaving Millbrook Hollow the moment the money cleared, rather than buying the fastest ticket to somewhere else and never looking back the way some might have, Reese found herself staying. She couldn't fully explain it, even to herself, except that something about the valley, the chapel, the quiet stubbornness of a town that had survived on almost nothing for decades, felt like it had chosen her as much as she had inherited it. She used a portion of the trust to properly restore the caretaker's cottage first, hiring a local contractor named Miles Okafor, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who had grown up in Millbrook Hollow and never left, who told her on their first meeting that he'd wondered for years what would eventually become of the old Hastings place. Building something isn't about rushing, he told her one afternoon, watching her attempt and fail to properly nail down a length of siding. It's about patience. You put in the slow work now, and the fast part comes later, when you least expect it and most need it. Reese took the lesson literally as much as figuratively. She learned to use a hammer properly, to mud drywall, to sand a floor down to raw wood before refinishing it, working alongside Miles most days, not because she needed to save money anymore, but because doing the work herself made the cottage feel earned rather than simply purchased. Her hands blistered and then calloused. She stopped flinching at splinters. She learned, slowly, the specific satisfaction of watching something broken become whole again under her own 2 hands. Word spread through Millbrook Hollow, as word does in towns small enough that everyone's business eventually becomes everyone's business. that the girl who'd inherited the old Hastings Chapel had also inherited real money, and, more importantly to the town, seemed to actually intend on staying and doing something with the property rather than selling it off to the first developer who came calling. The reaction, to Reese's quiet surprise, was less resentment than a kind of cautious warmth. Ferris, from the diner, began sending Reese home most evenings with a container of whatever the day's special had been, refusing payment, telling her it was the least she could do for the girl who'd cleared out her dish pit every weekend for a month without complaint. Walt Pemberton, the gas station owner, showed up one Saturday morning with a box of old chapel restoration photographs he'd apparently been holding onto for years, telling her that his own grandfather had helped build the original bell tower back in the 1920s, and that he'd always hoped someone would care enough to fix the place up properly someday. It was Walt, in fact, who first mentioned the annual Founders' Day festival held every October in the town square, a tradition going back over a century that had, in recent years, grown smaller and sadder as the town's population had continued its slow decline. He mentioned it carefully, almost shyly, the way a person raises an idea they're not sure they have any right to raise. It'd mean something, he said, if the chapel bell rang again for it. Nobody's heard that bell in near 60 years. Reese didn't answer right away. But she thought about it for days afterward, and the thought lodged itself somewhere she couldn't quite shake. Restoring the chapel itself was a far larger undertaking than the cottage had been, and Reese approached it the same way she'd approached everything since finding that chest beneath the altar, slowly, deliberately, determined to understand every piece of it rather than simply throw money at the problem until it disappeared. She hired a structural engineer from the county seat, a careful, soft-spoken woman named Grace Liu, who spent 2 full days assessing the building before delivering her verdict. The bones of the chapel, remarkably, were sound. Stone foundations built well over a century ago by people who built things to last generations, not decades. The roof needed full replacement. The bell tower needed reinforcement before any bell could safely hang in it again. The stained glass windows, buried under ivy for decades, needed careful, specialized restoration. But none of it, Grace assured her, was beyond saving. The restoration became, over the following months, something the whole town seemed to quietly rally around, even those who had never set foot in the chapel during Eleanor's decades of solitary stewardship. Miles Okafor took on the roof and structural carpentry personally, refusing to hand it off to a crew from outside the valley, telling Reese that this building deserved hands that already knew the town. An elderly stained glass restorer named Herschel Voss, retired for over a decade, came out of retirement specifically for the project, spending painstaking weeks cleaning and relighting each panel of colored glass by hand, refusing to rush even when Reese gently offered to pay him more to move faster. "Patience," he told her, echoing Miles' almost word for word, "isn't optional with glass this old. Rush it, and you lose it forever." Reese herself worked alongside them nearly every day, learning to strip old varnish from the pews rather than replace them outright, learning the particular rhythm of sanding stone free of decades of moss and grime without damaging the surface beneath, learning that restoration, real restoration, was rarely about making something look new again, but about carefully, respectfully revealing what had been there all along beneath the neglect. Some mornings she arrived before Miles or Herschel did, letting herself into the chapel while the light was still thin and gray, and simply sitting in one of the half-restored pews with a cup of coffee, listening to the building settle around her, feeling out its moods the way she imagined a longtime homeowner might, learning which floorboards creaked and which stayed silent, which corners held the cold longest into the day. She began keeping a small notebook, not for any practical purpose but out of some instinct she didn't fully examine, jotting down details she didn't want to lose, the exact shade of blue in the restored window when the afternoon sun hit it just right, the smell of fresh-cut pine shavings mixing with the older smell of stone and dust. The sound Miles made when he was satisfied with a piece of work, a short low hum, almost involuntary, that she'd started listening for without meaning to. Miles taught her to use a hand plane properly on the salvaged barnwood Otis Greaves had delivered, showing her how to read the grain before committing to a cut, how a blade dragged against the grain would tear and split no matter how sharp it was, while the same blade drawn with the grain would glide clean and smooth. You have to work with what the wood already wants to do, he told her one afternoon, shavings curling up from beneath his plane in long, pale ribbons. Fighting it just makes more work for both of you. Reese thought about that longer than she expected to, turning it over in her mind while she swept the day's sawdust into a pile that evening, wondering how much of her own life over the last 3 years had been exactly that. Fighting a grain that had never been going to bend the way she wanted it to. Herschel Voss worked at his own unhurried pace in a corner of the chapel he'd claimed as his temporary workshop. A folding table, covered in small tools Reese couldn't name, panes of colored glass laid out like puzzle pieces, waiting to be reassembled. He let her sit with him sometimes in the evenings, watching him carefully score and snap a piece of glass along a line so fine she could barely see it. Watching him lay molten lead came along the edges with a precision that seemed almost meditative. He told her stories while he worked, about learning the trade from his own father, about a cathedral restoration in Ohio he'd worked on decades earlier that had taken his crew the better part of 4 years to finish properly. 4 years, Reese repeated, unable to keep the disbelief out of her voice. Herschel had only shrugged, not looking up from his work. Some things are worth doing slowly, he said. This chapel waited 60 years for you. It can wait a few more months to be done right. The small kindnesses continued arriving in ways that never stopped catching Reese slightly off guard. A teenager named Josh Renner, whose family ran the hardware store 2 towns over, started showing up on weekends to help haul debris, refusing payment beyond gas money, telling her he was bored of his own town, and this felt like it mattered more. An older couple, the Abernathys, who Reese had never formally met, left a box of preserved jams and a note on the cottage porch one morning that simply read, "Heard what you're doing for the old place. Thought you could use a taste of something sweet while you work." Even Sherry, Reese's former stepmother, sent a single stiff, awkward email midway through the restoration, forwarded through a mutual old contact, saying only that she'd heard about the inheritance and hoped things were going well. Reese read it twice, felt very little, and did not reply, understanding for the first time that not every door needed to be reopened just because someone else finally decided to knock. By early September, the pews had been fully restored, refinished in a warm honeytone that Reese had chosen specifically because it reminded her of the color of the trust documents she'd found beneath the altar. The floor, once the deeper rot had been addressed, had been sanded and sealed, the old scarring left visible rather than hidden, because Grace Lou had gently suggested that some marks were worth keeping as part of the building's honest history rather than erasing entirely. The bell tower's reinforced frame stood ready and waiting, its scaffolding still up, for the bell that had not yet arrived from the foundry. Small kindnesses arrived throughout those months in ways she never fully anticipated and never stopped being moved by. A local farmer named Otis Greaves showed up one morning unannounced with a truckload of reclaimed barnwood, telling her it had been sitting in his hayloft for 30 years, waiting for a purpose he hadn't known until he heard about her project. A woman named Carmen Diallo, who ran a small quilting circle out of her home, arrived with a hand-stitched altar cloth she and 4 other women had spent weeks making once they heard the chapel might reopen for Founders' Day. Children from the town's tiny elementary school sent handmade drawings of what they imagined the restored chapel might look like, which Reese pinned to the cottage wall and looked at every morning while she drank her coffee. Not everything about those months was gentle. There were setbacks. A section of the newly stripped floor near the altar revealed rot far deeper than Grace Liu had initially assessed, spreading beneath 3 additional boards that had looked sound from above but crumbled to a soft, damp powder the moment Miles pressed a screwdriver into them, requiring weeks of additional structural work and no small amount of unexpected expense that Reese hadn't originally budgeted for. She remembered standing over the exposed joists that afternoon, calculating in her head how much of the trust she'd already spent, feeling for the first time since the letter beneath the altar a flicker of the old fear, the one that whispered that nothing good ever stayed good for very long, that something would always come along eventually to take it back. A storm in early September tore loose a portion of the roofing tarp before the new shingles had been fully installed, flooding 2 of the rear pews and forcing Miles and Reese to spend an entire miserable, soaked Tuesday bailing water out with buckets and salvaging what wood they could before it swelled beyond saving. Reese remembered the particular exhaustion of that day, her clothes soaked through, her hands pruned and aching, standing at nearly midnight beside Miles in the chapel doorway, watching the rain finally taper off, both of them too tired to speak, and Miles finally breaking the silence to tell her, quietly, that every restoration he'd ever worked on had a night exactly like this one. A night that felt like proof the whole project was cursed, and that the ones worth finishing were the ones you kept showing up for anyway. The morning after. There were nights Reese lay awake in the cottage, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that Eleanor herself had apparently never gotten around to fixing, second-guessing whether she was doing right by a woman she'd never met, or simply projecting her own need for redemption onto a pile of old stone that couldn't actually redeem anything. She thought often, during those sleepless stretches, about her mother, about the version of Diane who used to hum off-key while folding laundry, and she wondered whether her mother would recognize the person Reese had slowly become out here, calloused hands and sawdust in her hair, further from that laundromat parking lot with every passing week. She thought it would make her mother proud, though there was no way to know for certain, and that uncertainty itself became something she learned to sit with rather than resolve. But each morning, no matter how the night before had gone, she woke and returned to the work anyway. Because somewhere in the last several months, the chapel had stopped feeling like an inheritance and started feeling like a responsibility she'd chosen for herself, and there was a difference between the two that mattered more than she'd expected it to. It was during this stretch, roughly 2 months before the target date of Founders Day, that a second letter arrived, delivered not by any mail carrier but discovered by Herschel Voss while he carefully removed the final, most damaged stained glass panel from the western wall, the one so thoroughly buried under ivy that Reese hadn't been able to make out its image at all until the vines were finally stripped away. Tucked into the panel's wooden frame, protected from decades of weather by the leadwork around it, was a small folded note. Unsigned, the handwriting different from Eleanor's, older, more formal, clearly written by someone else entirely, someone from an earlier generation of the Hastings family. The note was brief. It read only, "To whoever finally lets the light back in. This window was my daughter's favorite. She used to say the blue glass looked like the exact color of the sky right before rain when everything felt possible. If you're reading this, it means someone finally cared enough to notice what we tried to protect. Thank you for finishing what we could not." There was no name attached, and Arthur Whitmore, when Reese asked him to help trace it, could only confirm that the note's handwriting matched samples from Eleanor's own mother, Reese's great-great-grandmother, a woman named Josephine Hastings, who had died decades before Eleanor herself, long before any formal record could explain what exactly had been tried and failed to protect, or why. Whitmore did manage to find one additional detail: Buried in an old county record he'd requested out of curiosity rather than necessity, Josephine's daughter, the one who had loved that particular window, had died very young. Before her 12th birthday, in a year when the valley had seen an especially hard winter and an especially poor harvest. There was no further explanation in the records, only a small entry in a church ledger noting the date. And Reese understood, standing in the chapel holding that unsigned note, that some griefs are simply too old and too deep to fully excavate. That some things a family protects are protected precisely because the pain underneath them never really stopped being unbearable. Even 60, even 100 years later. Herschel Voss, when she showed him the note, went quiet for a long moment before speaking. "That's why this glass survived under all that ivy while the others didn't," he said finally. "Someone wanted it protected. Wanted it left exactly as it was until the right person came to find it." He didn't elaborate further, and Reese didn't ask him to. Some things, she was learning, needed to be felt rather than explained, but Reese didn't need every answer. Standing in the chapel that afternoon, holding a note written by a woman 4 generations removed from her, addressed to no one in particular, and yet somehow addressed directly to her, she felt something settle into place that she hadn't realized was still unsettled. This land, this building, this entire fractured, complicated family history had been waiting a very long time for someone to come back and care about it. And now, someone had. Founders Day arrived on a clear, cool October morning, the kind of crisp autumn light that made even Millbrook Hollow's tired storefronts look almost cinematic. The air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves and, faintly, of Dot Ferris's cinnamon pies cooling on the diner's back counter since dawn. Reese woke before sunrise, unable to sleep any longer, and walked the 2 miles from the cottage to the town square in the gray early light past frost-tipped grass and the dark silhouettes of the oak trees, feeling something she hadn't quite felt before. A nervous, hopeful anticipation that reminded her, oddly, of the first day of a school year long before her mother had gotten sick, back when the future had still felt like something uncomplicated. The town square filled steadily from early afternoon onward. More people than Reese had seen gathered in one place since she'd arrived. Some of them locals she recognized from months of odd jobs and diner shifts, others former residents who'd driven back from wherever they'd scattered to once they heard the old chapel might finally reopen its doors. Walt Pemberton had strung small string lights between the oak trees lining the chapel's clearing, and had spent the better part of the previous week, he admitted sheepishly, testing and retesting every strand to make sure none of them would go dark partway through the evening. Dot Ferris had set up a folding table loaded with more pie than any town this size had any right to produce, and pressed a slice of the cinnamon into Reese's hands before she'd even had the chance to say hello. Carmen Diallo's altar cloth hung draped over the restored stone table at the front, its careful stitching catching the light, and Herschel Voss's painstakingly restored windows caught the afternoon sun in scattered patches of blue and red and gold across the freshly refinished floor, exactly the way Josephine Hastings's unsigned note had once promised they would. Miles Okafor arrived early to do a final check of the bell tower's reinforced frame and found Reese already there, sitting alone on the chapel steps, watching the crowd gather below. He sat beside her without a word for a while, the two of them simply watching Walt fuss over his string lights and Dot argue cheerfully with someone over pie slices. And finally he said, quietly, that Eleanor would have liked seeing this. All of it. The whole town gathered at the foot of a building she'd spent 60 years protecting alone. Reese hadn't trusted herself to answer that out loud, so she'd only nodded, and the two of them had sat together a while longer in the thinning afternoon light. At 4 o'clock, as the light began its slow autumn slide toward gold, Miles Okafor climbed the newly reinforced bell tower, and Reese climbed with him, and together they hung the new bell. cast specially over the preceding weeks by a foundry 2 counties over, engraved at Reese's quiet request with a single line taken directly from Eleanor's letter for whoever needed it enough to come looking. When the bell rang for the first time in nearly 60 years, the sound rolling out over the valley and the gathered crowd below, low and deep and impossibly clear. The whole square below fell silent to listen, Walt Pemberton removing his cap without seeming to notice he'd done it. Dot Ferris pressing a hand to her chest, children who had never once heard the sound stopping mid-run to stare up at the tower in open wonder. The sound rolled out past the town square, past the diner and the gas station and the leaning white steeple down the road, out over the valley itself, over the orchard long since reclaimed by forest and the family cemetery on the hillside and the mill that no longer stood, as though the whole landscape had been waiting 60 years to hear it again, too. Reese stood at the base of the tower with tears she didn't bother hiding, and she understood, more clearly than she had at any point since finding that chest beneath the altar, that Eleanor Hastings had never really been leaving her a chapel or a fortune at all. She had been leaving her a chance to matter to somewhere, and to something, in a way that nothing before this had ever let her, and a chance to finally understand that being needed by a place could feel every bit as steadying as being loved by a person. Your starting point doesn't define your ending. Sometimes what feels like the smallest inheritance becomes the greatest gift of all, not because of what it's worth, but because of what it asks you to become in order to earn it. Reese still lives in the cottage behind the chapel today, and most mornings she still walks the 2 miles into town before the light has fully broken, past the same oak trees, past the same gravel lane, greeting Walt Pemberton and Dot Ferris and the whole small, stubborn town that took her in when she had absolutely nothing left to offer it in return. The chapel bell rings every Founder's Day now, and on a handful of quiet Sunday mornings besides, not for any congregation, but simply because Reese likes the sound of it carrying out over the valley, a reminder that something broken enough to be forgotten can still, given enough patience and enough people willing to show up for it, be made whole again. If this story inspired you, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments. What's something difficult you've built in your own life? Something that started out broken and became worth more because of the patience you gave it?